Casey. And really, this is episode 1, isn't it? I mean, we've done the awkward introductions. In fact, the first time I get a review on iTunes, we're on iTunes, by the way, now. The first time I get a review on iTunes that says, cool it with the opening bants, I will cool it. But thank you for putting up with a bit of this at the start, just to wet my whistle. Thucydides. I'm not an expert in Thucydides. I've read The Peloponnesian War by Thucydides about 1.5 times. But I love it. I wish I had read it when I was younger so that it could have settled in a little better. But this is me trying to do you a service. Here we go. Buckle up. One of the distinctive features of history, as it's reported by Thucydides, and this is other than his famous unwillingness to include mythic and supernatural events, is his choice to quote generals and politicians and others even when the original text of their speech is lost. What he does is a kind of literary writing, I think, but he pulls it off so effectively that I, because I'm sure some people disagree here, I generally accept that the speeches quoted are more or less what would have been said. That is, they make sense given the context of what was going on at the time. The most famous example in the book is the funeral oration speech delivered by Heraclitus. If any of you have ever read any Thucydides, it's probably that. Sometimes that little bit makes it as an excerpt into anthologies and readers, although generally, I was never assigned anything by Thucydides. Anyway, so the speech, the funeral oration speech by Heraclitus is probably the most famous chunk of this. He was an Athenian statesman and general. But in another speech, after Heraclius persuaded Athens to go to war with Sparta, when the war turned ugly, he then delivered another speech, and it's this one I want to quote up front. Listen carefully to what he says after I take a sip of water. Don't forget to hydrate. Quote, "Certainly, if all else is well, and people have the stark choice of war or peace, it is great folly to go to war. But if, as was the case, the stark choice is either to submit and endure instant subjection to others, or to face the risks and win through, the greater blame lies in shirking the danger rather than standing up to it." And he continues about a page later. "You must not let yourselves be seen as doubly inferior to your fathers. They acquired these possessions not by inheritance from others, but through their own exertions, and furthermore kept them safe to hand unto you. And it is a greater disgrace to be robbed of what you possess than to fail in its acquisition. You must tackle the enemy, then, not only with conviction, but with the conviction of superiority. This is not the same as arrogance. Even the coward can be arrogant if his stupidity is combined with good luck. But the conviction I speak of derives from a reasoned confidence in superiority over the enemy. And that is what we have. Intelligent use of this confidence makes bold initiatives more secure, given equality of fortune. It does not rely on hope, which is a resort only when there is no other, but on a rational conclusion from the facts, which affords a firmer base for planning strategy." Man, isn't that nice? I mean, my goodness. Pause here for a minute before, I'm gonna even continue some of this speech in a second, so you can put a bookmark in your brain there. But ladies and gentlemen, this is the kind of deliberation and thoughtfulness and articulateness we want, isn't it, from our leaders when considering war. And it's also, maybe even more importantly, the kind of practical realism that people need when dealing with their enemies. Yes, enemies. Thucydides is very clear that every people has enemies. But if you have wealth and comfort and good health, you especially have enemies. Because, of course, they will want what you have. Listen to Heraclitus continue this speech. He says, and see if this sounds familiar. I love this. He says, "You all take pride in the prestige the city enjoys from empire. And you should be prepared to fight in defense of it. You cannot shirk the burden without abandoning also your pursuit of the glory. Do not think that the only issue at stake is slavery or freedom. There is also loss of empire, and the danger from the hatred incurred under your rule. You no longer have the option to abdicate from your empire. Should anyone, out of present fear, affect this idea as noble-sounding means of disengagement, the empire you possess is by now like a tyranny, perhaps wrong to acquire it, but certainly dangerous to let it go. Oof. I mean, you might have to rewind that because Thucydides writes at a level that is extraordinarily big verbal IQ, to put it in fancy words, right? And of course, we don't know exactly what Pericles said. You can read about Pericles. He was supposedly an excellent orator and, gave great thought to the speeches before he delivered them. So it's possible these were almost his words. But it reads, it fits right into Thucydides' narrative. And so I like to give Thucydides as much credit as Pericles here. But the point is, this is the political perspective that is, I believe, purposely hidden from people, especially American people, in public schools and on television and so on. We've all been raised to believe that there are no enemies, or at least that's how I was raised by MTV, basically. And no one who could possibly want to subvert our country or undermine our empire, right? That's what we were sort of told. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, like people from Japan or China or wherever, they just all wanted like Michael Jackson records, and it was and like McDonald's. And so we felt like who could possibly, not like America. We never thought of like having enemies when I was a kid, especially after the Cold War. But Thucydides warns. I mean, he is not into this. He says like I said, many of us have come to believe that it would be good if we abdicated from our empire and sort of folded and let someone else rise to the top. We've been taught that it wouldn't harm us much, or that everything would be better if America would pack it in. But Thucydides warns that that is not a realistic option. If you do fold and give up and become so weak as to let enemies take what is now yours, they will not govern you kindly because they do not feel that they have been governed kindly. This is the zero-sum game, and it tears the kumbaya mindset that's taught in Sunday schools and public schools and everywhere else to shreds. Do I wish that kumbaya mindset was the one that worked? Of course. Yes, I wish children would voluntarily share their toys with each other. That isn't human nature, is it? And Thucydides knew it, and he put it at the front of his discussion of what was going on in this 27-year war that took place between, I think, about 430, when was it? Might be 435 or so BC, right? So somewhere in the kind of second half of what would be the 5th century BC is when this war takes place. So we read Thucydides, but I mean, hold on. Did I get to play my, there was a clip I wanted to play there. Here it is, ready? Here's your clip that I should have played just a minute ago. Darn it, I missed it.
There comes a time when we heed a certain call, when the world must come together as one. There are people dying. Oh.
Yeah, whoa. Oh, there are people dying. What is that? That's We Are the World. And if you're exactly 42 years old, that song may have shaped your whole consciousness like it did mine. I was 7 when it came out. I knew every word. I sang along to the music video. Kevin from the Wonder Years is seen standing there in the front row and singing. Or if it wasn't him, it was, Lionel Richie, somebody else. So, okay, so that's the mindset that we are taught and that I think our like legislators and rulers and elites kind of want us to have. It is not the one that Thucydides presents in the Peloponnesian War, and that's what makes this book so interesting and so important. We read Thucydides because he gives us a window into a world where, and this is my thesis statement today, it's really a hypothesis, I guess, where he gives us a window into a world where the logos doesn't reign. I will explain what I mean by that before, this podcast ends, if not before this episode ends. But this is a very big thought. It's one I hadn't considered before I was about 38 years old. In fact, it's such a big idea that it will be the idea that helps me organize this entire podcast. Every episode constituting a tiny part of the big picture. And after 100 episodes, if you listen carefully, I hope you will understand what I think I'm starting to understand about this stuff, which is, again, the world where logos doesn't reign is brutal. Brutal. Much worse than anything we've seen in our lifetimes. Before we get further into Thucydides, there was something else I meant to say at the top. First of all, we're on iTunes. That's the one thing. We're on iTunes now. You can find it in the podcast app. Listen there. It's probably easiest. Like it, review it, rate it, send it to your mom. Do me those favors. I'm not asking for your money yet. Okay. The other thing is there was a correction from episode 1, humiliating correction to have to make. I was saying something about the pre-Socratics, and I said something about Parmenides and Heraclitus and, quote, Xenophon. Ugh, what an idiot. I'm sure you all knew that I meant Xenophanes. So embarrassing. Thanks for not calling me out on it. Okay, I don't think there's any other housekeeping stuff, as Sam Harris would say. I'm not going to do the Thucydides himself was a so-and-so guy born in so-and-so biography stuff, just because I'm on kind of limited time here. But you should probably read his Wikipedia entry. But his main work was the Peloponnesian War, which covers this terrible conflict between Athens and Sparta, which were independent city-states, but really the alliances that formed around those two city-states, and that lasted, as I said, 27 years. Do you see if any of you... I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but here's a little quick clip on what you've probably heard referred to as game theory.
What makes Nass's theory of equilibrium so special is that it presupposes that in each game there is at least one point of equilibrium and all players will be better off trying to find it and form their strategy around it. This momentous revelation helped people in disciplines like politics, war, economics, business, and social theory understand the world better and form better strategies.
Okay, so this is, you've probably, I'm not an expert, like I said, but you've probably heard of this, and it's the idea that, sometimes if we kind of cooperate, there can be a better outcome for everybody relatively, and it involves thinking about, the worst-case scenario and the best-case outcome and kind of doing that little Punnett square or whatever. Anyway, okay, so that's that. But what I was going to say is, there are, in my imagination now, having read Thucydides, 2 planet Earths. The one in which Logos, which is essentially Christianity, although perhaps we could argue about that later, the one in which Logos has delivered us from constant war and tribal strife, and then the one that goes the other way, right? And you might say, well, we have lived through plenty of wars. Casey, come on, what are you talking about? No. You have heard reports of war and seen images of military theater, and yes, a certain number of real human lives may have been involved, but the vast majority of people weren't threatened by these wars, and the social order may have even been reinforced by these wars. Like I said, I was almost 40 years old before I understood this, and I don't see how a modern person can understand this without reading Thucydides and Polybius, or listening to this podcast. Okay, what didn't I see, and what am I claiming you probably don't see? Well, it's the absolute horror of it. Quote, the Thracians poured into the city and began sacking the houses and temples and slaughtering the people. They spared neither old nor young, but automatically killed every person they found, children and women also, and even the very beasts of burden, and any other living creature they could see. These Thracians, when they have nothing to fear, are as bloodthirsty as any other barbarian race, even the worst. And here in Mycalessus, they brought total panic and destruction in every form, including the invasion of the largest school in the place. When the pupils had just come in for their lessons, they butchered the entire school. Whoa, right? Now, nothing like that has really happened, certainly not in America, for centuries. I mean, people might claim that something like, September 11th was a similar event or whatever, a school shooting. But really, the fact of these being one-off events is what makes them fall short. The ancients lived in a world where 9/11 was a commonplace. It happened all the time. Piracy, Thucydides says in the early pages, piracy was considered among the more noble ways of life, in this era or before this era. As soon as, this is a quote, as soon as traffic in ships developed between them, piracy was the recourse of the ancient Greeks and of the barbarians occupying the coastal regions of the mainland and the islands. They fell for their plunder on unwalled communities with populations scattered in villages, and this was much of their livelihood. Such occupation did not yet carry any stigma. Rather, it even brought some glory. End quote. Well, to me, this is all amazing, but the really staggering part about reading Thucydides is that he himself seems to have accepted these things as basically normal, as natural. And this is part of the, title of this podcast, right? Nature is brutal, Thucydides sees. And why wouldn't it be, right? Ho-hum. But of course, the toll it took on families was unimaginable. Here's another quote. He says, "Throughout the 7 days for which Eurymedon remained there after his arrival with the 60 ships, the Corcyraeans continued to murder those of their own people whom they considered enemies. The general charge was of conspiring to subvert the democracy, but some were killed out of private hostility, and others by their debtors, who had taken loans and owed them money. Death took every imaginable form, and as it happened at such times, anything went, and then worse still. Fathers killed their sons, men were dragged out of the sanctuaries and killed beside them. Some were even walled up in the temple of Dionysus and killed there." Like, whoa, you guys, right? You got to see it. You got to picture it in your imagination. The Peloponnesian War lasted 27 years with hardly any interruption except to deal with a plague, and it involved almost every tribe from Italy to the Black Sea. Technically, the Spartans won, but the Spartans themselves were decimated by other wars within a couple hundred years, and it wasn't in Greater Greece only that this inhumanity reigned. A minor digression here, because I want you to understand sort of the bigger picture this podcast is trying to put together. And here I'm going to quote from Tacitus. Tacitus is 5 centuries later Roman historian. And here he's describing the kind of not yet civilized German tribes. He says, quote, "There is a practice sometimes which has become the universal custom among the Chatti. As soon as they reach manhood, they let their hair and beard grow long and do not cut them until they have killed an enemy. It is a vow and a pledge to valor to cover their face. When they are standing over the bloody corpse and the spoils, they lay bare their faces and say that they have at last brought back booty deserving of recognition and have shown themselves worthy of their parents and their fatherland. The cowards and the unwarlike retain their unkempt hair." Wow. "The bravest also wear an iron ring like a manacle, a mark of dishonor among that people, until they have released themselves from it by killing an enemy." Disavow, needless to say. But the point is, the whole world was more violent, more tribal, more aggressive, more murderous. And still, I know there will be listeners who are inclined to shrug and write off these examples as anecdotal, or by some sort of chronological snobbery, they will believe that progress is somehow a part of nature. And that even if those humans back then lived like that, we enlightened, modern, iPhone-using, gentle people, we would never behave in like manner. The Roman historian Appian records in his civil wars that in 71 BC, the famous road leading into Rome, the Appian Way, was lined with more than 6,000 crucifixes, bodies of rebellious slaves hanging on each. Maybe you've seen the horrifying image of 3 or 4 bodies hanging from an overpass outside Juarez, Mexico. The collateral damage of some drug war. But can you imagine 6,000 of them lining I-95 as it passes through Washington, D.C.? And that scene occurred during the height of the Roman Republic, a period characterized by relative peace, where citizens were generally pleased to live in such stable circumstances. I'm trying to drive home this one point. That world could easily exist again. And darkly, I predict that it will, unless we come to understand, so that we can defend, a dynamic that gives rise to a different, truly more peaceful way of living. And so to clarify, my idea here is that we have been living in the luxurious afterglow, the momentum generated by the Logos, by Christianity, and that if we let go of that foundation, society will probably eventually return, almost certainly eventually return to the kind of brutality we saw before Christianity, the kind described by Thucydides. See if you remember this quote from a movie.
What if no one goes for the blonde? We don't get in each other's way, and we don't insult the other girls. That's the only way we win. That's the only way we all get laid.
What is that? A beautiful mind, right? What if no one goes for the blonde? What if we cooperate? We don't go for her, but together we will all be stronger. All right, so you get the idea, right? My main claim is that Logos is real and divine and the only thing standing between a world where we study things like this and, the other world, which is terrible and absolute horror. And my purpose really in the Thucydides episode, but also in many of these episodes, will be to kind of haunt you by that idea, because I think it causes people to reflect then on like, well, what should we do instead? Like, what's the escape from this? I mean, is it possible? Like, imagine a child raised in an ice cream shop with unlimited access to the chocolate and vanilla soft serve spigots. Is it possible to show that child so many clear images of starvation, of desert life, of war, infectious disease, brutality, that he finally begins to appreciate his current situation? And so this is an attempt to tell a very old story for modern times. That's a line right out of the beginning of Homer's Odyssey almost. Because, of course, Homer was writing about the Trojan War, which happened sometime around 1200 BC, but he wasn't writing it until 700 BC. It was already an ancient story by the time he wrote it down. So the point is, and like this story is much older than ancient Greece. I mean, our next episode, I'm going to do the Epic of Gilgamesh. This story may be so old that like it's the oldest. I've heard stories of like a 21,000-year-old cave painting depicting, a cyclopean giant and a hero in conflict, right? Like this is war. This is the shape of war, the structure of war. And so again, I'm trying to make us be realistic about how this happens. And it's going to keep happening. But we can minimize it maybe. So anyway, like so many stories, we begin in the middle of the action. We zoom in on the greater Mediterranean around the time of the pyramids, let's say, in Egypt when they were being constructed. And we don't have perfect data about what we see during that time. This story becomes clearer around the time of Homer's writings. But it seems that it was basically warfare, okay? And by the time we get to Thucydides, the picture becomes clearer. The picture includes the Corinthians, the Thessalonians, the Ephesians, the Colossians, the Philippians, the Galatians, the Romans, and the Hebrews. You recognize those? I hope you do. Those are books in the New Testament, right? Those are the locations that Paul was writing to, telling them about what? The good news. The Logos is here. Thucydides wrote, quote, "What is now called Greece was not originally a country of stable settlements. In earlier times, there were constant migrations, any group readily moving on from its present land each time they were forced out by others who happened to be superior in numbers. There was no trade, no secure communication with each other by land or sea. Each group grazed its own lands for subsistence, not building up financial reserves or farming the land, as it was never known when someone else might attack and take it from them." So, that's where we start. And I mean, there's so many. I wish I could do many episodes on this book and tell you about all the crazy war scenes, the triremes battering each other with the weird apparatuses and the men in their hoplite costumes and, dying. And just it's terrible. Okay, men dying all over the place. Famines, pestilence. And whichever side won, Thucydides records, raped the women and enslaved the children after killing all the men on the losing side. And such was life. Hold on. A little water. Remember to stay hydrated. But simultaneously, if you look a little closer, you zero in, slow your brain down a little bit, you see that in the sort of front corner of this stage, there are a few thinkers tinkering with ideas. Heraclitus from Ephesus, which is in modern Turkey. Parmenides of Elea, which is located in what's now southern Italy. You probably heard of them, the pre-Socratics. Meandering laboriously through purely abstract, labyrinthine arguments that seemed contradictory or absurd, they were trying to answer some question that perhaps hadn't even been properly formulated yet. Was reality changing or static? Was it many or one? Was nature the essence of reality or only a reflection of reality? Etc. Why were the pre-Socratics so good at generating questions? Well, I think it was related to the situation in this strife-filled world, where meaning is up for grabs because values are only established when identity and sovereignty are established. And those are established in war. Imagine Samuel Huntington's famous bit about the clash of civilizations, but with far more players involved. These were the birth pangs of the very different world that, thank goodness, we have largely inhabited. If these men generated questions that would last for ages, though they survived only in fragments, it must have been in part because they themselves had no idea what world was emerging. If you look closer with me at Heraclitus, look at the dates, right? He was born in 535 BC. He died around 475 BC. He's long been famous, and his stock seems to be rising even now, for introducing the term logos to philosophical discourse. And we can return to this. I mean, I'll do a whole episode on Heraclitus. But for now, consider that the world he knew by experience, starting around 550 BC, 100 years or so before Thucydides. Around the time of his birth, the Achaemenid Persian Empire conquered numerous Greek city-states, particularly focusing on subduing the Ionians. And I'm going to fast forward some here. And they crushed Ephesus at one point, right during the middle of Heraclitus' lifetime, when he was like my age. What did the Greeks do in response? They formed what was called the Delian League. And this is an important part of the story, I think. The Delian League is kind of like a political or bureaucratic effort to establish logos. It's when all the city-states in Greece kind of get together and they start to identify not as enemies now, but as like allies. And Greece emerges, right? Greater Greece, to defend itself against the Persians. The point is, Heraclitus grew up in this world, absolutely riven by tribal strife. He saw alliances made and broken, regimes rise and fall. All is flux, he famously concluded. And no wonder. But he caught a glimpse of something else. And there's a couple of really important fragments. I'll give you 1.5 of them. The first one goes like this. He says, "Though logos is true evermore, yet men are as unable to understand it when they hear it for the first time as before they have heard it at all. For though all things come to pass in accordance with this logos, men seem as if they had no experience of them. And when they make trial of words and deeds such as I set forth, dividing each thing according to its kind and showing how it truly is. But other men know not what they are doing when awake, even as they forget what they do in sleep." And that one's wordy and hard to understand, so listen to his shorter, more pithy explanation of the logos. He says, "So we must follow the common. Yet though my logos is common, the many live as if they had a wisdom of their own." Logos is common. It is shared. It is single. It suffuses nature. And yet only a few, the wise, understand this. Most people seem to think, that's my perspective, right? They each think their own experience is different and can't be squared away with others. So these are, like I said, fairly well known, and maybe I'll come back to them in future podcasts. The point is, I mean, what is going on here? Like, is there some sort of, I mean, in a sense, there's another fragment from Heraclitus, where he says, "The wise is one only. It is unwilling and willing to be called by the name of Zeus." Okay, Zeus, like that's really interesting, right? What is he talking about? This is some sort of like proto-monotheism. Zeus is common. Zeus is shared by all. This is like he's sort of groping for the idea of monotheism, like right out of the heart of like paganism here. And consider a paragraph from Sophocles, written a generation after the Delian League was formed. "Shall we lose faith in Delphi's obscurities, we who have heard the world's core discredited, and the sacred wood of Zeus at Elis praised no more? The deeds and the strange prophecies must make a pattern yet to be understood. Zeus, if indeed you are Lord of all, throned in light over night and day, mirror this in your endless mind. Our masters call the oracle words on the wind, and the Delphic vision blind. Their hearts no longer know Apollo, and reverence for the gods has died away." And that is like one generation before Thucydides. So the gods, the reverence for the gods has died away, and now all you have is not logos, but just perspective, right? Everybody seeing things differently, thinking their own thing, etc. And this is where the violence, the scene of the violence, unfolds in Thucydides. Again, I'll come back to all this stuff about logos, but that's like how I'm reading it, okay? Now, actually, I have one more paragraph if you can stand it on logos. Like the logos. What do I mean by this? Isn't it just a metaphysical term having little bearing on political reality? I don't think so at all. Instead, I think that when Paul announced logos to the Greeks, he was inviting them to form a new sort of alliance. Self-interest would no longer dominate decisions about policy. You know, I want the blonde, but then you realize, well, what if no one goes for the blonde? And we sort of team up, and you take this one and I'll take this one, and then, you know, we're all going to win. Instead, I think, like I said, he invited them to a new sort of alliance. Self-interest would no longer dominate, but rather cooperation and unification of smaller factions would be possible. And so in this way, Heraclitus tried to announce logos to the Greeks. In fact, the leaders of the Delian League, or the Achaean League, tried to construct something similar to logos, something to end the strife. But it was finally Paul's vision that took root. After logos was made intelligible to the Greeks and to the Romans, anyone who insisted on holding out as a standalone tribe would be marginalized. The Philippians, the Corinthians, the Ephesians, and the Thessalonians would now be one new people, one new man, as Ephesians chapter 2 says. All right, a couple more points about Thucydides. The contrast to all of this political realism, or of this political realism, is exemplified by the famous Melian dialogue. I think it's found in Book 5 of Thucydides. The Athenians call for a very honest dialogue, saying, quote, "Keep this discussion practical within the limits of what we both really think. You know as well as we do that when we are talking on the human plane, questions of justice only arise when there is equal power to compel. In terms of practicality, the dominant exact what they can, and the weak concede what they must." End quote. And the Melians replied immediately, "There is advantage, and we must speak of advantage, since you have put justice to one side and made expediency the basis of discussion. There is advantage in your preserving the principle of the common good, ... And the discussion goes on for a very nervous, tentative 5 more pages from there. And logos, is one thing. I mean, political alliances are another. It never goes quite smooth in Thucydides. So, for understanding and reporting all of this, Thucydides is also considered to be the father of modern political realism. And I think that's maybe the most valuable part of reading it if you're a naive utopian. One more thing about him before I go. The plague. Great description of a plague in Book 2 of Thucydides. And it seems timely because of Corona. He says he himself caught the plague. I'm just going to read some chunks from this. He says, the outbreak, it is said, originated in Ethiopia. There were rumors that the Peloponnesians had poisoned the wells. He says the sensation of burning heat inside the body was so strong that sufferers could not bear the pressure of even the lightest clothing or sheets or anything other than going naked, and their greatest wish was to plunge into cold water. Many who had no one to look after them did in fact throw themselves into cisterns, overcome by an insatiable thirst. But as a rule, the quantity of water drunk made no difference. A constant infliction was desperate restlessness and the inability to sleep. There were those who, on recovery, suffered immediate and total loss of memory, not knowing who they were and unable to recognize their friends. I'm just skipping around here, but the suffering was made yet more acute by the influx from the country into the city. Chaotic conditions. The dead and the dying were piled on top of each other, and half-dead creatures staggered about the streets and round every fountain, craving for water. The sanctuaries in which they had encamped were full of corpses. People dying there were not moved. All sacred and secular constraints came to be ignored under the overwhelming impact of the disaster, which left men no recourse. All previously observed funeral customs were confounded. Blah, blah, blah. They would bring the corpse to a pyre already lit, throwing it on top of the other bodies in the flames, and then run away. Here's a fascinating insight into human nature here, too. He says, in other respects, too, the plague was the beginning of increased lawlessness in the city. People were less inhibited in the indulgence of pleasures previously concealed when they saw the rapid changes of fortune, the prosperous suddenly dead, and the once indigent now possessing their fortune. As a result, they decided to look for satisfactions that were quick and pleasurable, reckoning that neither life nor wealth would last long. No one was prepared to persevere in what had once been thought the path of honor, as they could well be dead before that destination was reached. Immediate pleasure and any means profitable to that end became the new honor and the new value. No fear of God or human law was any constraint. Pious or impious made no difference in their view, when they could see all dying without distinction. As for offenses against the law, no one expected to live long enough to be brought to justice and pay the penalty. They thought that a much heavier sentence had already been passed and was hanging over them, so they might as well have some enjoyment of life before it fell. And let me see if I can, where's the last section I was going to read to you there? There were also, the other thing about this that's so interesting is they did consult the oracles. They had like a sense of the supernatural. Consulting the oracles here would be, what's weird is it's like, on the one hand, you think of the oracles as being supernatural, but it sounds very much like the news, basically. Like there's this line where he says, oracle mongers chanted all manner of predictions, eagerly snapped up by each man according to his preference. So it's like these oracles, a lot of them must have been complete hucksters, right? Just sort of making stuff up. But they would go to these temples. There was a pan-Hellenic or a pan-Greek agreement not to destroy the religious temples in any town. So in general, they would not do that. Although in this war, it gets so bad towards the end that they just completely desecrate the altars and sort of stop worrying about that. Let's see. Is there anything else I wanted to read to you in this? The funeral oration. I didn't actually love the funeral oration because it seems so basic to me. He sounds like a contemporary American Democratic president or something, which just isn't all that interesting. I prefer actually the speech given, the sort of anti-democratic speech given later by Cleon, where he says I'll read you some of this and then I'll quit. He goes, I've often thought on previous occasions that democracy is incapable of running an empire, and your present change of mind over Mytilene is a prime example. With no reason for fear or suspicion in the daily conduct of life among yourselves, you apply the same principle to relations with your allies, and do not realize that allowing them to talk you into mistaken policies or succumbing to pity is to display a weakness which spells danger for you and brings no gratitude from them. You do not reflect that your empire is a tyranny exercised over unwilling subjects who will conspire against you. Their obedience is not won by concessions made to your own detriment, but by a domination based on force rather than popularity. Skipping a little bit, he says, the good sense which comes with intellectual naivete is a more valuable quality than the sophistication which knows no morals, and generally it is the ordinary folk who make the better citizens compared with their cleverer fellows. The clever ones want to appear wiser than the laws, and to win in any public debate. And if this was the most important way of displaying their intellect, and the result of such behavior is usually the ruin of their city. The ordinary folk, on the other hand, with no confidence in their own intelligence, accept the superior wisdom of the laws and do not presume the polished debater's ability to dissect a speech. But as impartial judges rather than competitors, they generally reach the right conclusion. And he talks about this daily rhetoric in the public square. He says, the result of these rhetorical contests is that the prizes go to others while the city bears the risks. And you are to blame for organizing these perverse games. You like to be spectators of speeches and an audience of actions. You certainly win the prize for gullibility to novel arguments and rejection of the tried and tested. You are slaves to any passing paradox and sneer at anything familiar. Every one of you would like to be an orator himself, gulp, but failing that is keen to match his wits against those who do have that skill and to show himself abreast of the argument. You applaud a sharp point before it is made. You're eager to anticipate what is said, but slow to foresee its consequences. You are, in effect, looking for a different world from that in which we live, and you cannot even think clearly about our present circumstances. Frankly, you are in thrall to the pleasure of listening, and you sit here more like spectators at the sophists' displays than men taking decisions for their city. What a great man. Isn't that an amazing book? I wish I could say more about it, but I'm keeping it to one episode a book. Maybe we'll come back to that logos stuff in future episodes.
If there's no logos, there's only one thing that's going to settle any dispute, and that's violence.
All right, thanks for listening. See you next time when we discuss the Epic of Gilgamesh. Bye-bye.